They said he dishonored her in the river that night, tore her dress, touched what no man should. So Caleb Thorne never tried to defend himself. He just let the silence bury him alive under 10 years of dust and whispers, until one morning the wind changed and the horizon filled with something no one could mistake. 300 Apache warriors riding in, slow, deliberate, like a storm that had already decided where it would strike. The town froze. Rifles came out. Men lined the streets, waiting for blood. And Caleb, he stepped out alone, boots heavy in the dirt, eyes steady, like a man who'd already accepted the ending. Then something hit the ground in front of him. A worn leather bracelet, darkened by time. The same one he'd wrapped around a dying girl's wrist to keep her alive. And the world went quiet, because from the front of those riders, a woman stepped forward, tall, unshaken, eyes like fire held in control. And without a word, she dropped to her knees in the dust. 300 warriors following her like falling thunder, and every man in that town felt it. The truth they got wrong for a decade. But Caleb didn't smile, didn't speak. He just looked at her, and slowly reached for the bracelet. Like he already knew this wasn't the end of the story. They said he ruined her honor, and by sunrise, he'd already lost his place in the world. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me, because this one rides quiet. The wind that morning carried dust across Caleb Thorne's porch in slow, restless waves, the kind that whispered before something changed, and he stood there like he always did, one hand resting on the old wood rail, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. A man who had learned to expect very little from the world, and even less from the people in it. 10 years had a way of carving silence into a man, and Caleb wore it like a second skin. Folks in town didn't say much when he passed through anymore, not out loud. But their eyes did enough talking, quiet judgment, old stories that never faded, the kind that stuck like burrs under a saddle. They remembered the river. They remembered the girl. Or at least, they remembered what they thought they saw. Caleb never corrected them. Never tried. Some things, once spoken wrong, stayed wrong no matter how many words you spent trying to fix them. And words, out here, were cheap. It was the morning light that shifted first, cutting through the dust at a sharper angle, turning the horizon into a thin line of gold and shadow. And that's when Caleb noticed it. Not a sound. Not yet. Just a feeling. The kind a man gets before a storm rolls in across open land. He narrowed his eyes slightly, leaning forward just enough to see past the heat shimmer. And there it was, a movement. Distant. Steady. Too organized to be cattle. Too deliberate to be anything else. Riders. More than a few. His jaw tightened. But he didn't reach for the rifle resting by the door. Not yet. Down in the valley, the town hadn't noticed. Not yet. Smoke still rose lazy from chimneys. A wagon creaked along the main road. And somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular, unaware that the world was already shifting beneath its feet. Caleb stepped off the porch slowly, boots pressing into dry dirt that hadn't seen rain in months, his shadow stretching long behind him. And as he walked a few paces forward, the shapes on the horizon sharpened into something clearer, something heavier. Not 10 riders. Not 20. Dozens. Then more. A line that kept growing until it stopped looking like a group and started looking like a message. The dust rose behind them like a curtain, and even from miles out, there was something about the way they moved, calm, controlled, inevitable, that made the air feel thinner in Caleb's lungs. He exhaled once, slow, steady. So, he murmured under his breath, not to anyone in particular. It finally caught up. The past had a way of riding patient out here. It didn't rush, didn't shout. It just waited until the day it didn't have to wait anymore. And as the first distant echo of hoofbeats finally reached him, soft, rhythmic, undeniable, Caleb Thorne didn't turn back toward the house. He didn't close the door. He didn't run. He just stood there, alone in the open, watching 300 riders come for a story the world had gotten wrong. The first thing Caleb noticed was not fear coming from the town. It was noise, small at first, a door slamming somewhere down the slope, then another, then the hurried clatter of boots against wood as men stepped out into the street with that same look he had seen too many times before, a look that did not ask questions, only prepared for answers that had already been decided. And within minutes the quiet valley that had slept through 10 ordinary years began to tighten like a rope pulled too far, too fast. Sheriff Harlan was the first to spot the riders. Clearly, he stepped out from his office, squinting into the rising dust, one hand resting near his belt not out of readiness, but out of habit. And when the shape of that long, unbroken line finally settled into his eyes, his shoulders dropped just a fraction, not from relief, but from the weight of understanding what kind of morning this had become. "That is no trading party," he muttered, low enough that only the wind answered him. And behind him, others gathered, farmers with rough hands, shopkeepers who had never held a rifle steady for more than a minute, boys trying to stand taller than they felt, all of them staring toward the same horizon where the riders kept coming, steady as time, unhurried, unstoppable. And someone said Caleb's name, not loud, not accusing, just spoken like a fact that had finally found its place. "This is about him." And no one argued, because in towns like this, stories did not fade. They waited, and 10 years ago, Caleb Thorne had become one of those stories, the kind people told in lowered voices, the kind that changed shape depending on who remembered it. Some said he had crossed a line no man should cross. Others said he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But none of them had been there long enough to know the truth, and Caleb had never given them one. He had just stayed, quiet, steady, carrying the weight of their version because it was easier than fighting a thing already carved into stone. And now that stone was cracking. The riders were close enough that the ground itself seemed to hum under their approach. Not loud, not violent, just present, like thunder that had not yet chosen to speak. And then something strange happened, something that made the men in the street shift uneasily. The riders did not spread out, did not circle, did not reach for anything that looked like a threat. They rode in a straight line toward Caleb's land as if the rest of the town did not exist, as if every building, every man, every whispered judgment held no weight at all. And that was when fear changed shape, because it was one thing to be surrounded, it was another to be ignored. Caleb saw it too, standing alone out there with nothing but open ground behind him. He watched the way they moved, the way the line stayed tight, disciplined, silent, and his eyes narrowed just enough to catch the smallest detail. No raised weapons, no shouted commands, no signs of chaos, only intention. And that was what unsettled him most, because intention meant purpose, and purpose meant memory, and memory meant the past had not just returned. It had been carried carefully across every mile to reach him. The hoofbeats grew clearer now, each one landing with quiet certainty. And as the first riders reached the edge of his land, they slowed, not in hesitation, but in respect, as if they were crossing into something that mattered. And Caleb felt something shift deep in his chest. Not fear, not yet. Something older, something tied to a river, to cold water and torn fabric, and a pair of eyes that had looked at him not with gratitude, but with something far more complicated. And before he could place it, before he could decide what this moment was asking of him, the front rider stepped forward slightly, and for the first time since they appeared, the line stopped moving, completely, like the world itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see what Caleb Thorne would do next. For a moment, no one moved, not the riders, not the men in town, not even the wind that had been restless all morning. It just hung there, caught between two worlds that did not trust each other but could not look away. And Caleb stood at the center of it like a man who had been here before, even if the details were different, even if the stakes had grown heavier with time. He took one slow step forward, boots pressing into the same dry earth he had walked for years, and the sound carried farther than it should have, sharp in the silence. And from the front of the line, the lead rider shifted, not reaching for anything, not signaling the others, just moving enough to let the horse breathe. And that small movement told Caleb more than any shout ever could. This was not chaos. This was control, and control meant someone was holding it together. Someone with purpose strong enough to guide 300 souls across miles of unforgiving land without breaking formation. His eyes searched past the first rider, past the second, scanning the line with quiet precision until he found it. Not a face, not yet, but a presence, something in the way the riders parted just slightly at the center, not enough for a clear path, just enough to mark importance. And Caleb felt it then, a memory pushing forward from a place he had kept buried, not because it hurt, but because it had never been finished. The river came back first. Cold and fast, the sound of water striking stone, the weight of a body, slipping beneath the current, and then the fabric in his hands, torn not by intent but by urgency. A choice made in a heartbeat that would echo for years. He remembered the look in her eyes when she realized what had happened. Not gratitude, not relief, something sharper, something tied to a world he did not fully understand. And he had let her go, said nothing, explained nothing, because some lines, once crossed even by accident, could not be talked away, and now that moment stood in front of him again, not as memory, but as consequence. The lead rider finally turned slightly in the saddle, just enough for the figure behind to come forward, and the line opened with quiet respect, not wide, not dramatic, just enough, and she stepped through it like she had always belonged at the front of something greater, taller than he remembered, steadier, her presence carrying weight that did not need to be proven. Her eyes found his immediately, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have. The years between them disappeared, leaving only that river, that choice, that silence that had followed. Caleb did not reach for a weapon, did not speak. He simply stood there and met her gaze, because whatever this was, it had not come all this way for words spoken. Too soon. And then she moved, slow, deliberate, guiding her horse a few steps closer until the distance between them felt less like a field and more like a line drawn long ago. And from somewhere behind her, a rider dismounted, walked forward, and placed something gently on the ground between them, careful, almost reverent, and stepped back without a sound. Caleb's eyes dropped to it, and the world narrowed in a way that made everything else fade. It was small, worn, shaped by time and memory. A leather bracelet darkened by years but unmistakable in its form, the same one he had tied around a trembling wrist beside a river that had nearly taken more than it gave. And as he looked at it, truly looked, he understood something the town did not, something the years had not erased. This was not the beginning of a reckoning. This was the continuation of a moment that had never been answered. And when he lifted his gaze again, her eyes had not left him, steady, searching, not for guilt, not for fear, but for something far more difficult to carry, the truth he had never spoken, and the one she had carried back across every mile to place in front of him. Without a single word, Caleb did not bend to pick up the bracelet. Not yet, because some things carried more weight than leather and time, and he understood that the moment he touched it, the past would no longer be something distant. It would be standing right there between them, undeniable, and so he let it rest in the dust, just as it had rested in his memory for 10 long years, untouched, unanswered. The wind moved again, soft this time, brushing across the open land and stirring the edges of coats and reins, but still no one spoke, not from the riders, not from the town watching from a distance, because whatever this was, it did not belong to them. It belonged to the two people standing at the center of it, the ones who had carried it longer than anyone else. She slid down from her horse with a quiet grace that spoke of control, boots meeting the ground without a sound, and when she stepped forward, the distance between them closed just enough to make the air feel tighter, more deliberate. Caleb noticed the small details. The way a man does when he has learned to read what is not said. The way her shoulders held steady, not tense, not relaxed. The way her hands remained open at her sides, not reaching, not guarding. The way her eyes never wavered, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to face, recognition. And that was what unsettled him most, because anger he could understand. Anger had edges, it pushed, it demanded, but this waited, and waiting meant patience, and patience meant she had not come for a quick answer. She had come for something deeper, something that had taken years to shape. She stopped a few feet from him, close enough that he could see the faint lines time had placed around her eyes, not as weakness, but as proof of distance traveled, choices made, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain. It felt full, like a space holding everything that had never been said. Caleb finally lowered his gaze to the bracelet once more. The leather worn smooth in places where fingers had once tightened it against a pulse that had nearly slipped away. He remembered the weight of it in his hands that night, the way the river had roared around them, the cold cutting through everything, the urgency that had left no room for careful thought, only action, and the moment after, when she had looked at him not with thanks, but with a kind of fear shaped by something older than either of them, something tied to rules he had not known, lines he had not seen until he had already crossed them, and he had chosen silence, because he had believed it was the least harm he could do. But standing here now, he could see what silence had cost, not just him, not just her, but the truth itself, twisted into something the world had accepted without question, and slowly, without breaking eye contact. Caleb stepped forward, one step, then another, until he stood over the bracelet, and the movement rippled outward in a way no one spoke about, a shift in the riders behind her, not forward, not aggressive, just aware, like a breath held collectively. And when he finally bent down, the motion was deliberate, unhurried, his fingers closing around the worn leather with the same care he had used years ago, as if time had not dulled the importance of that simple act. He straightened, the bracelet now resting in his palm, and for the first time since they had faced each other again, something changed in her expression, not visible to most, not something the town would ever notice from where they stood, but Caleb saw it, a small release, a fraction of tension easing, like a question that had been waiting had finally begun to receive its answer. And still, no words came, because some truths were not spoken first. They were shown, proven, carried in the way a man chose to stand when the past returned and asked him who he really was. And Caleb Thorne, with the weight of 10 years in his hand, took one more step forward into the space between them, ready, for the first time, to let the silence break. The space between them felt smaller now, not because the distance had changed, but because the weight inside it had. Caleb could feel it in the way the air settled, in the way even the horses behind her stood quieter, as if they understood this moment did not belong to movement, it belonged to truth. And he held the bracelet in his hand like something fragile, not because it might break, but because it already had once, in a way neither of them had ever spoken about. His fingers turned it slightly, the worn leather catching the light, and for a brief second, the past rose again, sharper than before, the river, the cold, the urgency, the choice, and then the silence that followed, the kind that had stretched for years, shaping everything that came after. He lifted his eyes back to hers, steady now, no hesitation left in them, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried low, even, not loud enough for the town to hear, not meant for them. "I did not know," he said, each word placed carefully, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a truth that had waited too long. "I saw you falling. I saw the water taking you, and I did what I could to pull you out. Nothing more, nothing less." The wind moved softly across the ground between them, but she did not look away, did not interrupt. She listened, not just to the words, but to the way he stood behind them, the way his shoulders held no weight of hiding, only the weight of what had been carried in silence. "I knew something was wrong after," he continued, slower now, as if each memory had to pass through years before reaching his voice. "The way you looked at me, the way you stepped back, I understood I had crossed something I did not see. So I let you go. I thought that was the right thing to do." His hand lowered slightly, the bracelet still resting in his palm. "I did not think my silence would become a story." And there it was, the thing he had never said, not to the town, not to himself in words, only carried in the quiet spaces between days. And for the first time, it was no longer just his, it was shared, placed between them like the bracelet had been, waiting to be understood. She took a slow step forward, close enough now that the space between them felt deliberate, chosen, her eyes still on his, searching not for the past, but for the truth inside the man standing before her now. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying a weight that did not need to rise to be heard. "You did not take anything from me," she said, and the words moved through the silence like something long overdue. "You gave me back my life." The air shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that even the men watching from the town felt something they could not name, because this was not what they had expected, not what they had prepared for. Caleb did not move right away, the words settling into him slower than they had reached his ears, not because he doubted them, but because they carried something he had not allowed himself to believe, not fully, not until now. And behind her, The riders remained still, not as a threat, not as a force waiting to act, but as witnesses to something that had traveled across years to reach this exact moment. She lowered her gaze briefly, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement, and then, without hesitation, she bent her knee, lowering herself into the dust between them, a gesture that did not ask, did not plead, but honored. And it was in that moment, before anything else could happen, before the town could react, before the silence could shift again, that Caleb understood this had never been about judgment. It had always been about truth finding its way back. No matter how long it took the moment her knee touched the ground, the world behind her followed, not in command, not in fear, but in understanding, one by one. Then in waves so quiet it felt like the earth itself was lowering with them. 300 warriors stepped down from their horses and knelt in the dust, not a single voice rising, not a single weapon lifted, only the sound of leather and breath and the soft settling of boots against dry ground. And the town forgot how to move. Men who had stood ready just minutes before now found their hands hanging useless at their sides, rifles lowering inch by inch without anyone giving the order, because nothing they had prepared for fit what they were seeing, nothing made sense in the way they expected it to. Caleb stood there in the center of it, the bracelet still resting in his hand, watching something unfold that no man could have predicted, not because it was grand, but because it was quiet, and quiet carried a weight louder than anything else out here. He looked down at her, still kneeling, her head slightly lowered, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and he felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with the past, and everything to do with what stood in front of him now. The truth had arrived, not with force, not with demand, but with patience, carried across miles and years just to be placed gently at his feet. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb Thorne did not feel like a man being judged. He felt like a man being seen, fully, clearly, without the noise of others shaping the story for him. His fingers tightened slightly around the bracelet, then loosened again, and slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer, closing the last of the distance between them, not as a defense, not as a challenge, but as an answer. And when he reached her, he did something the town would talk about for years but never fully understand. He lowered himself too, one knee meeting the dust across from hers, not above, not apart, but equal, the movement sending a ripple through the stillness, not loud, not sudden, but deep, because this was not how men out here were used to seeing things resolved. No raised voices, no final declarations, just two people meeting at the same level where the truth had always been waiting. She lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes again, and there was something different there now, something settled, something at peace, and Caleb held the bracelet out between them, palm open, offering it back not as a return, but as a recognition of everything it had carried, everything it had survived. "It belongs to you," he said quietly, the words simple, unadorned, but steady in a way that did not need to be stronger. She looked at it for a moment, then back at him, and slowly, she closed her fingers around it, not pulling it away quickly, but accepting it with care, like something that had come full circle. And behind her, the warriors remained still, not waiting for a signal, not expecting more, because they already knew this was the reason they had come, not for conflict, not for repayment, but for something far rarer out here, something that could not be taken, only given, the truth, placed where it belonged. And in the distance, the town began to shift again, not in fear this time, but in something quieter, something closer to understanding, though none of them would say it out loud, because out here, men did not often admit when they had been wrong, but they felt it, in the way their shoulders eased, in the way their eyes no longer looked at Caleb with the same certainty they once had. And as the wind moved gently across the land once more, carrying dust and sunlight together in a soft haze, the moment settled into something lasting, not loud, not celebrated, just real, the kind of truth that did not need to be told twice, because once was enough for those willing to see it. And Caleb Thorne, still kneeling there in the quiet center of it all, understood something he had not allowed himself to believe before, that sometimes the past does not come back to punish. It comes back to set a man free. The dust settled slowly, like the land itself was trying to remember how to breathe again. and for a long moment after both of them had knelt, nothing changed on the surface, but everything beneath it had already shifted. Caleb felt it first in the silence. Not the empty kind he had lived with for years, but a fuller one that held weight and meaning, the kind that did not press down on a man, but lifted something off him. And when he finally rose, it was not with hesitation, not with the careful distance he used to keep between himself and the world, but with a quiet certainty that had been missing for longer than he could remember. She stood as well, the bracelet now resting in her hand, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that spoke of something carried, protected, not forgotten, and behind her, the warriors followed, not in unison like before, but naturally, as if the moment of stillness had served its purpose and no longer needed to be held. The town watched, unsure of what came next, unsure if this quiet ending was truly an ending at all. Sheriff Harlan stepped forward slightly, not crossing the invisible line that had formed between the two sides, but close enough to show that he was no longer hiding behind it. His eyes moved from Caleb to the woman, then to the riders behind her, and for once, there was no judgment there, only the careful awareness of a man realizing he had been standing on the wrong side of a story for far too long. Caleb noticed it, but said nothing, because this was not a moment that needed words from anyone else. She turned her head slightly, glancing back at her people, and though she gave no signal, something passed between them, something understood without being spoken, a shift in posture, a quiet readiness, not for conflict, but for departure. And when she looked back at Caleb, there was a finality in her gaze, not an end, but a completion, like a path that had finally reached where it was always meant to go. "The story they told about you," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach him and no further. "It does not belong to you anymore." The words settled between them, simple, but heavier than anything that had come before, because they did not just acknowledge the past, they released it. And Caleb felt that release in a way he could not put into words, like a weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there had suddenly been lifted, not taken, not forced away, just set down. And for the first time in years, he realized how much space that weight had been taking inside him. She stepped back then, not turning away immediately, not breaking the connection too quickly, but giving the moment the respect it deserved, the time it needed to settle into something real, something lasting. And when she finally turned, it was with the same calm purpose she had arrived with, her people moving with her, not rushing, not lingering, simply following the path that had brought them here and now led them away. The sound of hooves returned, soft at first, then growing as the line began to move, the dust rising again. But this time it did not feel like a warning. It felt like something closing, something complete. The town remained still as they passed, no one stepping forward, no one calling out, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to prove, and Caleb stood there, watching them go, not as a man left behind, but as a man who had finally been returned to himself. The land around him looked the same, the house, the fence, the long stretch of dry earth that had not changed in years, but something inside it had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the ground had settled after a long storm. And as the last of the riders disappeared into the distance, the dust slowly fading back into the horizon, Caleb Thorne did not move right away. He just stood there, in the quiet that followed, feeling the kind of stillness that does not come from being alone, but from finally being understood. And somewhere behind him, the town began to breathe again, different now, quieter, as if even they knew that what had happened out there would not be spoken about the same way ever again. The sound of the riders faded into the distance, not all at once, but in layers, hoofbeats softening, dust settling, until the horizon swallowed them whole and left nothing behind but open land and a silence that felt different from the one that came before. Caleb stood there longer than he needed to, eyes fixed on where they had been, not because he expected them to return, but because something inside him was still catching up to what had just passed. 10 years of weight did not lift in a single moment without leaving a trace, and he felt it in his chest, in the way his breathing slowed, in the way his shoulders no longer held that quiet tension he had learned to carry without noticing. Behind him, the town began to stir, cautious at first. Like men waking from a dream, they were not sure how to explain. Boots moved against dirt, Low voices started and stopped, and then Sheriff Harlan stepped forward again, this time crossing the space that had once felt like a boundary, his hat low, his steps measured, not as a man coming to question, but as one coming to understand. He stopped a few feet from Caleb, not too close, not too distant, and for a moment he said nothing, just looked out at the empty horizon where the riders had disappeared, as if trying to see something that was no longer there. "I reckon," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "We got it wrong." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any apology shouted across a crowd. Caleb did not answer right away, not because he did not hear him, but because he was not sure what answering would change. Some things were not meant to be fixed with words after the fact. They were meant to be understood in silence. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the man without breaking the stillness that had settled around him, and Harlan gave a small nod, not expecting more, not asking for it, because for the first time, he seemed to understand that this was not something that could be settled between two men in a single conversation. It was something that would take time, carried in the way people looked at Caleb from this day forward, in the way they chose to speak, or chose not to. And as the sheriff stepped back, leaving him to the quiet once more, the rest of the town followed his. Led in their own way, no one approached, no one pressed him with questions. They simply watched, then turned, one by one, returning to their lives with something unspoken settling into them, a shift that would not show itself all at once, but would be there, in small ways, in changed glances, in fewer whispers, in the absence of certain words that once came too easily. Caleb remained where he was, the land stretching out around him the same as it had always been, dry, wide, unchanging, and yet not the same, because the story that had once filled it had been cleared, not erased, but corrected, placed back where it belonged. And for the first time in years, the space felt open again, not empty, but open, like a path that had been blocked had finally been cleared. He turned back toward the house slowly, boots pressing into the dirt with a steadiness that felt new. Though nothing about the ground had changed, the porch creaked under his weight as he stepped up, the familiar sound grounding him in something simple, something real. And when he reached the door, he paused, his hand resting against the worn wood, not to open it, not yet, but to feel the stillness that had settled inside him. It was not relief, not exactly. It was something quieter, something deeper, like a balance that had finally been restored without anyone forcing it. And as the wind moved once more across the open land, carrying the last traces of dust away into the distance, Caleb Thorne stood there in the doorway of a life that had not changed on the outside, but had shifted entirely within, and for the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not feel like something he was hiding inside. It felt like something he had chosen, something that finally belonged to him. The door did not open right away, not because Caleb hesitated, but because for the first time in years, there was no urgency pushing him forward, no weight behind him forcing him inside. He stood there with his hand resting on the wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, the small cracks and worn edges that time had carved into it. And it struck him how much of his life had been spent holding on to things just like this. Surfaces, routines, quiet habits that asked nothing and gave just enough to keep a man moving without ever asking why. He finally pushed the door open, slow, steady, the hinges giving their familiar creak, and the inside of the house greeted him the same as it always had. Simple, still, untouched by what had just unfolded outside. The table sat where it always did, the chair slightly angled from where he had left it that morning, a tin cup near the edge catching a thin line of sunlight that slipped through the window. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Caleb stepped inside and closed the door behind him, not shutting the world out, just letting it settle where it belonged. He moved toward the table, each step deliberate, not heavy, not light, just present. And when he reached the chair, he pulled it out and sat down, the wood creaking softly under his weight, the same sound he had heard every day for years. But today it did not feel like a routine. It felt like a choice. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, eyes lowering to the surface in front of him. And for a moment, his mind went quiet, not empty, but clear, like a sky after a storm had passed through and left. Nothing behind but space. And in that space, something new had room to exist, not a thought, not a plan, just a feeling he had not known in a long time. The absence of something that had once defined him, the absence of being watched, judged, misunderstood, and it was strange how heavy that absence felt at first, like a man who had carried a load so long that standing without it made him unsure of his balance. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him deeper than usual, and as it did, a memory surfaced. Not of the river, not of the moment everyone else had built their stories around, but of something smaller, quieter, the way she had looked at him just before she turned away that day. Not with anger, not even with fear, but with something unfinished, something waiting, and he realized now that it had never been about what had happened. It had been about what had not been said, and today, that silence had finally found its answer. He reached up and took the tin cup in his hand, turning it slightly, the metal cool against his skin, and for a moment, he just held it, not drinking, not moving, just feeling the simple weight of it, grounding himself in something real, something present. Outside, the faint sounds of the town drifted through the walls, distant voices, a wagon rolling slowly along the road. Life continuing as it always did, but different now. Not in a way that would be spoken about openly, not in a way that would change the shape of the town overnight, but in a quieter way, in the way people would remember this day when they looked at Caleb Thorne, in the way they would choose their words more carefully, or choose not to speak at all, and that was enough. More than enough. He set the cup back down on the table, the soft sound marking the end of something he had carried for too long, and he leaned back in the chair slightly, his gaze lifting toward the window, where the light had shifted just enough to mark the passing of time, the day moving forward as it always would, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb did not feel like he was standing still while the world moved around him. He felt like he was part of it again, not pulled, not pushed, just there, and as the light settled across the room, warm and steady, Caleb Thorne sat in the quiet of his own home, not as a man hiding from a story, but as a man who had finally stepped out of one that no longer belonged to him. The light shifted slowly across the wooden floor, stretching longer through the window as the afternoon leaned toward evening, and Caleb remained seated for a while, without counting the time. Not because he had nowhere to be, but because for the first time in years, there was no weight pulling him away from stillness. The kind of stillness that did not feel like hiding, but like choosing to remain. And when he finally stood, it was not with the heaviness of habit, but with a quiet intention that felt unfamiliar in the best way. He stepped outside again, the porch boards greeting him with the same old creak, the same worn rhythm. But even that sound seemed different now, less like a reminder of isolation and more like something steady beneath his feet. The land stretched out before him just as it always had, wide and dry and honest in a way only the frontier could be, but the emptiness no longer pressed in the same way. It felt open, not hollow, and down in the distance, the town moved with its usual rhythm, though there was something quieter in it now, a hesitation that had not been there before, as if the people below were still adjusting to a truth that had arrived without asking their permission. Caleb rested his hands on the porch rail again, the same place he had stood that morning. But the man standing there now was not quite the same one who had watched the horizon fill with dust, and he knew it, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the small things, in the way his shoulders no longer carried that constant tension, in the way his eyes moved across the land without expecting trouble to follow every silence. And as he looked out, he noticed something he had not paid attention to in a long time, the details, the way the light caught the edges of the fence posts. The faint movement of grass bending under a soft breeze, the distant shape of a hawk circling high above, all the things that had been there every day, waiting, but had gone unseen because his world had been narrowed by something heavier, something that no longer held him in place. He exhaled slowly, letting the air settle into his chest, and for a moment, he allowed himself to simply stand there, not thinking ahead, not looking back, just present. And it was in that quiet presence that another thought surfaced, not as a burden, but as a possibility, something he had not considered in years. The idea that life did not have to remain the same just because it always had been, that the path ahead was not fixed by the past behind him. And it was a strange thought, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like stepping onto ground that looked the same but felt different underfoot. He did not act on it right away, did not rush to change anything. Because change out here did not come from sudden decisions. it came from steady ones, built over time, and for now, it was enough to recognize that the choice existed at all, that he was no longer bound to a version of himself shaped by something that had never truly been his to carry. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, and the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of dust and dry grass together. A familiar smell that no longer felt tied to loneliness, but to something quieter, something grounded. And as Caleb Thorne stood there watching the day move toward its end, he realized that nothing around him had changed, not the house, not the land, not the town in the distance. And yet everything had shifted in a way that did not need to be seen to be understood, and for the first time in a long while. The future did not feel like something he had to endure. It felt like something he might one day choose. The evening settled in without asking for attention, the sky turning a deeper shade as the last light stretched thin across the horizon. And Caleb remained on the porch longer than usual, not because he was waiting for something, but because he no longer felt the need to go inside just to escape the quiet. The quiet had changed. It no longer pressed against him. It no longer reminded him of what was missing. Instead, it felt like something that belonged, something earned. And down in the town, small changes had already begun to take root, not loud, not announced, but visible to anyone who knew where to look. A man who once would have turned his back now paused instead, offering a brief nod when Caleb's name came up in passing. A shopkeeper who had kept his distance now spoke of him without the edge that used to linger in his voice. And Sheriff Harlan, a man who had carried certainty like a badge, now carried something quieter, something closer to thought than judgment. These were not grand gestures, not the kind that would be remembered in stories, but they mattered, because out here, change did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in small choices repeated over time. Caleb noticed it, not because he was looking for it, but because it no longer needed to be hidden from him. And as the light faded further, he stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the ground, with a steady rhythm, and began to walk, not toward any destination in particular, just across the stretch of land he had known for years, the fence line running along his right, the open field to his left, the same path he had walked countless times before. But tonight, each step felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just his. And as he moved, his thoughts did not drift back to the past the way they once had. They did not circle around the same unanswered questions, the same quiet doubts. Instead, they stayed with him, in the present, in the way the air cooled against his skin, in the way the ground felt firm beneath his boots, in the simple fact that he was walking forward without anything pulling him back. He stopped near the far edge of his land, where the fence met open space and the horizon stretched wide and uninterrupted. And for a moment, he just stood there, looking out at the fading light, the last traces of gold slipping away into blue. And in that moment, something settled fully into place inside him. Not a realization, not a sudden understanding, but a quiet acceptance of what had already happened, that the story he had carried was no longer his, that the weight he had borne had been set down not by force, but by truth, and that what remained was not emptiness, but space, space to live without that shadow shaping every step. He rested his hand lightly on the top rail of the fence, fingers brushing against the rough wood, and allowed himself to stand there without needing to move, without needing to fill the silence with thought. And as the first stars began to appear above, faint at first, then clearer against the darkening sky, Caleb Thorne stood at the edge of his land, not as a man marked by what had been misunderstood, but as a man who had outlasted it, who had carried it without breaking, and who had finally been given something rare out here, not forgiveness, not redemption, but something simpler and far more powerful. The truth returned to its rightful place. And for the first time in a long while, the night did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something he could step into without hesitation. The night deepened without urgency, the kind that settled slowly over the land like a blanket that knew exactly where to rest. And Caleb remained by the fence longer than he intended, not because he was lost in thought, but because for once, he was not. His mind did not reach backward, did not search for meaning in something already resolved. It simply stayed where he was, grounded in the quiet rhythm of the moment. And that was new, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like a man learning to stand without leaning on something he had carried for too long. The stars above grew clearer, one by one, spreading across the sky in patterns that had always been there, unnoticed, overlooked, the way many things in his life had been, and he found himself watching them, without needing to name them, without needing to understand them, just present. And as he stood there, the faint sound of footsteps approached from behind, slow, deliberate, not cautious, not hesitant, just steady. And Caleb did not turn right away, not out of distrust, but because he already knew who it was. Sheriff Harlan had a way of walking that carried its own rhythm, measured, thoughtful, like a man who had started listening more than speaking. "Evening," Harlan said quietly as he came to a stop a few feet away, his voice low enough not to disturb the stillness that had settled across the land. Caleb nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and for a moment, that was enough. The two men standing side by side, looking out at the same stretch of darkness that no longer felt empty, just open, and Harlan cleared his throat softly, not out of discomfort, but as if choosing his words carefully, something he had not always done before. "I have been thinking," he said, pausing briefly, "about how easy it is for a town to decide what a man is without ever asking him." The words hung there, not heavy, not accusing, just honest, and Caleb let them settle without interruption, because this was not something that needed to be answered quickly. Harlan continued, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "We see a moment, just one, and we build a whole story around it. And once it is built, it sticks, even when it should not." He shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle, but enough to show the thought behind it. "Today made me realize we were not just wrong about you. We were wrong about how we chose to see." Caleb finally turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the man beside him, and there was no bitterness in his expression, no need to correct or challenge what had already been said, because the truth had already done that on its own. "People do what they think they understand," Caleb said quietly, his voice steady, not defensive, not forgiving, just clear. "Most of the time, they do not realize what they do not see." Harlan nodded slowly, the words landing deeper than he expected, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again, the silence returning. But this time it carried something different, not just acceptance, but a kind of shared understanding, not perfect, not complete, but enough to move forward from. And after a while, Harlan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, just reflection. "Funny thing is," he said, "you never once tried to set us straight." Caleb's gaze returned to the horizon, the faint outline of the land stretching out before him. "Some stories are not meant to be argued," he replied. "They are meant to be lived long enough for the truth to find them." The words settled between them, simple, but carrying something deeper than explanation, and Harlan nodded again, slower this time, as if he understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. And after another quiet moment, he stepped back slightly, not turning away immediately, but giving the space back to Caleb. "Good night, Thorn," he said, his voice carrying a quiet respect that had not been there before. And as he walked away, his footsteps fading into the night, Caleb remained where he was, watching the stars, feeling the stillness settle fully into place around him, not as something to endure, but as something he had chosen. And in that quiet, under a sky that had always been there, but had never felt this close, Caleb Thorne stood not as a man defined by what others once believed, but as a man who had outlasted it long enough to become something simpler, something truer. Himself. The night held steady long after the last footsteps had faded, the kind of quiet that did not ask anything from a man, but offered him space if he was willing to take it. And Caleb remained there a while longer, not counting minutes, not measuring anything at all, just standing beneath a sky that stretched wider than anything he had ever tried to hold on to. And for once, he did not feel the need to hold on to anything. The past had already loosened its grip, not through force, not through forgetting, but through something far simpler. It had been seen clearly, and that had been enough. He finally turned back toward the house, not with the weight of habit, but with a steadiness that felt earned, each step carrying him forward without hesitation. The porch greeted him again with its familiar sound, but it no longer echoed in the same way. It no longer felt like the boundary between him and the world. It felt like a place he could step onto without leaving anything behind. He paused at the door, his hand resting lightly against the wood, and for a brief moment, he looked back out across the land, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging what had been and what was now finished. The horizon lay quiet, empty of riders, empty of dust, but not empty of meaning, because something had passed through it that morning, something that had changed the shape of everything without leaving a mark that could be seen from a distance, only felt by those who had stood close enough to understand it. He opened the door and stepped inside, the room waiting just as it had before, simple, still, unchanged, and yet it welcomed him differently now, not as a place to retreat, but as a place to live. He moved through it slowly, not out of caution, but out of awareness, noticing the small things again. The way the light from the lamp softened the edges of the walls, the quiet creak of the floor beneath his boots, the steady presence of objects that had not moved, but now felt part of something whole rather than something he hid among. He set a hand on the back of the chair for a moment, then let it go, choosing not to sit, choosing instead to move, and he crossed the room to the window, looking out at the night that had settled fully over the land, the stars brighter now, the darkness deeper, but not heavy, not pressing, just present, and in that presence, he felt something settle into its final place inside him, not a thought, not a realization that needed to be spoken, but a quiet certainty that what had come to him that day had not been about proving anything, not to the town, not to the riders, not even to himself. It had been about something simpler, something that did not ask for recognition, only for truth to stand where it belonged, and once it had, everything else had shifted around it without needing to be forced. He stood there for a while, letting that understanding rest without trying to shape it into anything more, because it did not need more, it was enough. And after some time, he turned away from the window, the room behind him steady, the night outside unchanged, and he moved toward the door once more, not to leave, but to close it, not against the world, but with it, a quiet ending to a day that had carried more than any other in years. And as the latch settled into place with a soft, final sound, Caleb Thorne stood in the stillness of his home, not as a man who had been cleared of something, not as a man who had been forgiven, but as a man who had outlasted a story that was never truly his. And in the quiet that followed, there was no need for anything else, no need for words, no need for proof, because out here, the truth did not need to be spoken twice. It only needed to arrive, and once it did, it stayed, settling into the land, into the silence, into the man who had waited long enough to see it return.